with that, where is Mandy? Mandy, are you in the room? Oh, there you are. I want to hand it off to Mandy, who is with the Tacoma Pierce County Health Department, to lead the next panel. Thank you, Mandy.
Is it on? It is on now. Woo! All right. Thank you, Thashari. All right. So, thank you all for being here today. We are going to dive right into this conversation on trauma-informed services. Before I start asking our beautiful, wonderful, intelligent panelists questions, I wanted to let you all know that this panel is going to be slightly different from the other panels that we've been doing today. So it's almost like a call and response. I'm going to ask our panelists a bunch of questions in 10-minute increments. So they're going to answer questions for 10 minutes, and then we're going to shoot to y'all in the audience, and you're going to work at your tables on the scenarios that we have passed out during the break. And then you'll have 10 minutes to work on those scenarios in your at your tables, and then we're going to call time, and we're going to come back to the panelists to move into the next layer of questions. So, my name is Mandy Lee. I'm the Racial Equity and Justice Community Engagement Coordinator at Tacoma Pierce County Health Department. And up here with me today is Ziquora Banks from Verity Credit Union and Ashley McGirt-Adair, correct?
Adair.
Adair.
That's all right.
I had to go pee real bad, and I didn't even ask you. I apologize for not getting that clarified. Hey, I give too much information. That's how I run panels. This gentleman up here is giving me the stink eye, like, oh my God, this girl, I swear. Anyways, I got to keep you awake. But Ashley owns McGirt Counseling and Services and is a part of the Therapy Fund Foundation, right?
Yes, I'm the CEO and founder.
Yes, CEO and founder.
Yes.
And Ms. Banks is the vice president. What's your title?
So, as of a year, Chief Impact Strategy Officer at Verity Credit Union.
Yes. So what I'm saying is that we have highly intelligent, experienced, knowledgeable folks up here who are going to answer some questions. And we're going to start off with Ashley. Ashley, how does trauma impact folks' ability to manage finances and achieve financial well-being? These are like Miss America questions, so
Well, I ain't Miss America.
we're gonna start off deep.
As a trauma therapist, I always like to really define what trauma is first. So trauma is anything that overwhelms the nervous system and makes it to where we cannot function in the ways that we normally would. And so what is trauma? It's anything. It's natural disasters. It's war. It's racism. It's knowing that your bank account was just overdrawn. We talked about a scenario that earlier in the workshop prior to this, and what does that look like? It's finding out at 18 that your parents used your name and now you have poor credit and you've accumulated all of this debt. That is trauma. Trauma is really anything. We've got big T traumas and we got little t traumas. And I always say trauma is however you define it, because what's traumatic to me may not be traumatic to you. And so when we're talking about trauma and how it impacts our well-being, financial trauma, we really have to look at finances as a relationship. So money is one of the longest relationships many of us will ever have, which begins around the age of 3 when we begin to form that relationship with money. And if we're being honest, many of us have a dysfunctional relationship with money. We are in a toxic trauma bond with money. And it impacts our ability to form relationships with others, to buy homes, set boundaries. It impacts our spending habits, how we see money, how we view money, how we value it. Me personally, I grew up in a home where money was used as a form of control and power. I seen my mother in relationship with men who would control her because of that money. So I made a vow to never take money from a man. And so that impacts me, and now my relationship with my husband, you know, and how I take money from him, and it's like, nah, I want you to have money. Yeah. But we have to think about how those relationships were formed, and that was me personally in childhood, watching my mother be controlled by men, and I'm like, a man will never control me in that way when it comes to money. We can look at a child who saw their parents argue over money, and then in adulthood, they have difficulty having conversations around money based on trauma. Generational trauma, ancestral trauma. Yes. These are things that impact our mental health and our well-being. It makes it difficult for us to go into a bank, want a bank. And like I said, it's all developed in childhood from media, things that we see, things that we've seen other people experience. In the world of therapy and psychology, we call it vicarious trauma, whereas it didn't actually happen to you directly, but you saw somebody else experience that. So, you know, I saw somebody's wages be garnished, so I'm not going to get a bank because I know that they can come into your bank account and they can garnish your wages, so I'm going to keep my money in a box under my bed, and that's a form of trauma. And, you know, it impacts our health. Our physical, you know, getting gray hairs, being stressed out, how we feel it in our body. I'm a somatic clinician, so I'm always looking at how that relationship with money and trauma takes place in our body. I've said the word money several times, so just y'all hearing me say that money, what is the response that you have in hearing somebody else say money? Are you having a visceral response? Do you feel it in your chest? Do you feel it in your head, in your stomach? So really paying attention to that, and those are just some of the ways in which trauma can impact our well-being in our body when it comes to finances.
Yes.
Ow. I think also you said money, and how are we responding to the word money? And I was responding to the word trauma, because we use that word constantly, and we don't necessarily have a good understanding and a grasp of the idea of trauma, and we definitely don't understand other people's perceptions and experiences in their lives and how trauma affects them. So yeah, it's definitely, we feel words in our bodies, and we don't know necessarily which words are causing which type of reaction. Yeah. And that kind of leads me to you, Ziquora. Mm-hmm. When we say trauma-informed services, yeah, from like a systems level or an institution level, yeah, what does trauma-informed services look like?
Yeah. Yeah, just one more time, please. A couple of snaps up, because this is really going to be a fire, you know, conversation today. You know, I do want to make sure I put this out there. I by no means am an expert on this topic, but I think from a systems level, from a financial institution perspective, to really bring that into the organization, the way that Verity has been looking at it is the interactions with, you know, our members and community on a day-to-day basis, right? So some of the services would be things like financial coaching, which many of you may be providers of financial coaching. But how is that trauma informed? How are we, you know, opening up the space within our financial institution, our credit union, to be a space of belonging and welcoming? You hear about stories all the times where, you know, folks are, you know, in a position where they come in and then the police is called on them. Right? For us, it goes so deep. We really have to look internally first to look at the ways in which, as an organization that has been around since the 1930s, right, the Great Depression, has operated with policies, with the way in which we're providing services, and to really ingrain that in the system itself, right, to operationalize that through. So for us, it's starting from a place of really analyzing what policies do we have, right, in place that are causing harm, that are really creating experiences to our members that are, you know, they walk in the door and they're not able to get an account. That is trauma, right, to be denied access to account. I know there was a mention of Bank On, right? But even, you know, with that as well, how are we ensuring that we're not otherizing people in that process too, that it's not a special program, right, you may hear from financial institutions. So for us, I think it's really a matter of analyzing everything, both internally, the way that we show up in partnership and community, but also the programs that we have and the partners that we build trust with to really ensure that folks do get access.
Well said. Y'all are saying so many things, my brain can't keep up this afternoon. I apparently needed chocolate up here too. Get you some chocolate. But that will lead us into our first round of questions at your tables. So everybody at your tables, you should have scenarios. And yes, if you want to give a round of applause to Ziquora, because beautiful comments.
Oh, hey, chocolate.
Ziquora and Ashley. So at your tables, you should have a scenario with 3 sets of questions. Some of the questions are a little weird. Thank you for giving us a little bit of grace. We had some technical issues this morning. But you should have a scenario that is related to your table topic. And then for the next 10 minutes at your table, answer the 2 questions in question number 1. Have that conversation and that discussion, and we'll come back in 10 minutes.
So I was just looking at this from a personal perspective because in the Justice Involved group, so I am someone who's justice involved. I did almost 8 years in prison. And when I got out, I've been out 26 years now, but I can relate to this of like what it would be like to the trauma, of having been in that environment. And then there's a lot of things I don't want to apply to this story that's not here, but it's like the disconnect from the family, getting out the uncertainty of how I'm gonna take care of myself. You get out, you got legal fines, and that's different from restitutions, because if I hurt you and did something to you, they can impose a $50,000 fine. I need to pay you back, but then there's these legal fines, and then you got a job, and you're assuming that this person, when they went, they had education, they had job skills when they went, so on and so on and so on. So it could be really traumatizing. The last thing is like, you know, why would I go in a bank? What's in a bank for me? I mean, they're gonna ask me questions, and you have a hard time getting ID when you get out. There's all these other barriers that just continues to stack on top of that. And it's like, you know, the last thing I'm worried about is getting a bank account, or the last thing I'm worried about is, you know, trying to do, you know, I'm trying to survive. And this particular individual, you know, was working a seasonal job, was worried about getting a car, getting transportation, and the list just goes on. And I could just reflect back to my own experience when I got out. It was just so overwhelming. Like Jenny was saying, like they just drop you off and it's like, here, go figure this out, but here's a whole list of things not to do, but nobody really gave you any guidance and prepared you for that. So that trauma of being incarcerated just continues to be reinforced. So.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's, when we built the scenarios, we kept several things in mind. One is, how real are these scenarios? And so we pulled from our own experiences, experiences that our family has had, our friends have had, and we put that into each scenario so that this sounds familiar. This, like, really, for each table, it shouldn't be a surprise when you read through it. But it is, I'm probably gonna use this metaphor wrong, but it's compounded interest, right? Every time you turn around, your client or your participant or whoever you're working with is just gonna add another layer, because they're in the thick of the trauma. They're in the thick of it, and they're not thinking about all 15 different things, or maybe they are, but they are so overwhelmed that they're only working with you on one issue. And then the next meeting you find out about issue B, and then the next meeting you find out about issue C. And so sometimes it can take time to even get the full story before you can help them to the best of your ability. Thank you very much for sharing. So we are gonna bring our panelists back front and center instead of me being front and center, and ask another question. So we were talking a little bit about trauma-informed services, which are in many ways solutions-based, right? Because we're like, here's a service that we can provide that might avoid or circumnavigate trauma and the way that it's impacted you. But what are the systemic barriers that make us have to create trauma-informed services? What are the barriers that you have seen, both for individuals trying to access financial services or financial programs, but also for organizations that are looking to implement trauma-informed services?
So in my work as a trauma therapist, I see a lot of systemic barriers that are in play when it comes to individuals accessing services. I'm in private practice, which is a privilege for many individuals when you have a clinician who may not accept insurance and you have to be able to pay out of pocket $100 to $300 an hour. Many people do not have that kind of access to funds. And then when you look at access to care and the way that insurance reimburses, it's from a crisis-centered model, so you actually need to have a diagnosis in order for me to be reimbursed from the insurance company. So if you just want to come talk to a clinician about the normal day-to-days of life and want to use your insurance, I have to get creative in the approach that I utilize. I can say you have an adjustment disorder, you're adjusting to the day-to-days, but insurance is going to start having their red flags come up, like how long is this a person adjusting to this just because they don't meet a DSM-5 diagnosis, which is why I started the Therapy Fund Foundation in an effort to eliminate barriers to Black healing and provide free therapy to Black community members. And when we're looking at systemic barriers that also impact my clients, we have to look at it financially from the lens of redlining in Black communities and how we still have not recovered from that today, and it's impacting us. I mean, the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure mortgages to Black families, which in turn shut out Black families from access to generational wealth, accumulating wealth. Through a first-time homeowner down payment assistance, I was able to buy my first home 10 years ago. I sold that home. The funds from that home, I was able to then buy 3 other properties. And so just think about the access to financial wealth that Black and brown families would be able to have just from things like home ownership and being able to sell and utilize that money. I'm the only one in my immediate family who owns property, and a lot of that was due from the down payment assistance that I received, and then the equity that I gained in that home, which was almost just shy of $500,000 when I sold it, that I made to then buy more properties. But Black and brown families, we don't have that because of systemic racism that prevented us from the home buyer process. So I deal a lot with that when it comes to systemic barriers and finances and, encountering individuals who are suffering from generational trauma, but they can't afford my services, or they don't have insurance. Or if they do have insurance, their insurance provider doesn't have a clinician that is culturally responsive, that understands the things in which they're going through, that understands the impact that racism has on our mental health. Or they don't know how to budget and save that $100 to $200 bi-weekly or every week to be able to receive therapeutic services. Also, the fact that we haven't been able to invest, and what does that look like when we have communities who've been left out of investing and being able to accumulate wealth? That impacts us. It impacts us mentally. It impacts where we live. Our zip code literally determines our life expectancy outcomes. If we look at our ACE scores, our adverse childhood experiences, and we know that if you have an ACE score of 6 or higher, which most Black and brown people do, your mortality rate is already decreased by 20 years. And if you're not familiar with the ACE score, it's questions like, do you have someone in your home who's incarcerated, a parent who argued? So there's a 10 set of questions, and all you have to do is score 6 or higher, and you're already set up for poor outcomes. And all of this is due to systemic racism and other barriers financially that harm us as communities of color and people in general, which are some of the things that I see as a clinician when working with individuals, having to set up a financial plan, having to talk about budgeting. Okay, so if we take this pot of money, these coffees, and then you can invest in your health and well-being, or even therapists, we're not taught this. And I went to some of the best universities in the world, HBCU, Clark Atlanta, University of Washington, Harvard, and they didn't teach us to budget or how to set up our businesses and go into private practice. And these are, like I said, some of the best universities in the world that don't set you up for success. And then you have these clinicians who have people coming in with financial trauma, and they haven't even dealt with their own financial trauma or their own money stories. And that's a barrier right there in and of itself in my world, in the world of behavioral health.
I think we just need to give Ashley a standing O after every every answer. Yeah. You said several things that really jumped out for me, and the very last thing that you said, all I could think of is when you're on an airplane and the flight attendant says to put on your own mask first and then help others. It's so true. I know so many people who provide financial counseling, financial coaching, who are also experiencing financial hardship and financial trauma. And so it's not to say that they're not good enough, that they can't do that work, but it's also how can we help ourselves. So Cora, do you have comments or answers?
Absolutely. I mean, you definitely hit on so much, the intersections even in the financial industry, right? We have a lot of staff members that may not have, the education or bring in the lived experiences, right, of trauma from different communities. And so it's important as a financial institution especially to be able to connect to that, right? To be able to understand that a lot of the policies even that have been created, some even around, if a member comes into the branch or a customer comes into the branch, and let's just say that, they're operating in a specific way and acting in a specific way, there are some policies that, will automatically in a split decision an employee is making, well, they need to go. Let me call the police, right? Let me go ahead and make sure that we close down their account. But who is that done to, right? What is the experiences that folks, have in those situations? It just continues to compound the trauma. If we need to close a membership of a member, there are some, community members that come in and are spewing racist things. What is the commitment of the organization to ensure that their staff on the other side also aren't being impacted by that as well? I mean, you talk about systems of oppression. We're all impacted by oppression differently, right? But we're all impacted by that. So as a financial institution, there's a lot of work that needs to happen internally first. A lot of work that needs to go internally first. I'll say that again, especially around the way in which, we have specific products for communities. We're trying to do good, right? We live off of that. We want to do good for our communities, but not recognizing the harm if somebody comes into a branch and they're trying to establish an account and maybe they are on check systems. Well, your institution is operating off of check systems, right? And so now this individual can't open an account that could be, something that could position them to be able to start that financial stability journey, right? And so you have to assess and evaluate. Is this something that we still need to continue to operate on? This system existed how long ago, right? Who are we excluding in this? What is the data telling us, right? Do we not have data that supports that? I know I'll speak for our credit union. I mean, we're under $1 billion in assets, and so in financial institution, we're a smaller credit union, right? But there's a lot of things that don't exist that we needed to build processes and policies for. But who's making those decisions, right? Are there folks that are, on the executive team that may not have a connection to the lived experiences, folks in the community, or, how their staff are feeling with that, being able to really ensure that there is co-creation in that process, that you're ensuring that you're hearing from community and making sure that is built into the process. Not from a saviorism standpoint, but really from a process of how can we build together, right? How can we ensure, if you're saying, yeah, this checking account doesn't work for me and this is why, your operating hours don't work for me and this is why, well, what are the models that are being created to ensure that it is inclusive of folks that may have to work after 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, right? How can we create different access points? And so I think that there's a lot of things that compound, right? There's a lot of things that in a financial institution, we are trained a certain way, we operate in a certain way, but we really have to break from that. And there's a lot of good work happening, I will say that. But this journey takes time, and it's not overnight. It's not just a check the box, here, let's go ahead and do this program, and we're out doing great, right? But it really is being intentional about changing the way in which the system itself is connected, to community, is connected to your staff. So it's not, separated from.
And I'll add also, as we're talking about systems of oppression and racism and bias, so I shared how I was able to accumulate wealth from selling the first home that I got from down payment assistance. But what I didn't tell you is that when I was selling that home, I had to rid it of all remnants of blackness due to anti-blackness so that my home wasn't devalued. I had to get rid of all my black hair care products, make sure there's no grease, there's no black products, all my beautiful black art, so that I could ensure that I was getting the best rate, the best value for my home, because we know that individuals who go in those homes, if they see a black person lived in it, they're automatically going to devalue it.
I think to that point too, we hear a lot about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. There's been a lot that we've been hearing around those programs being attacked, but it truly is a strategy, right, as an organization. It should be very much a part of the business plan and not separate from, right, because in those situations, folks really do operate in biases that, it's just the way in which they've come up in this system. And so if you have folks that are able to identify those points of, this is an issue, right? We have the Black Homeownership Initiative that exists, right, for a reason. I think there are things that we can't take lightly as a financial institution or service provider, whatever it may be, but the way in which, we truly all do operate within these systems and the impact that it has.
Did you all hear that? Good. I have a question for the audience. Show of hands. How many of you work at an organization that created a DEI statement after the murder of George Floyd? Show of hands. Who made a DEI statement? Do you know what is on your organization's DEI statement? Do you know how your organization holds itself accountable to that DEI statement? If you don't know the answer to any of those questions, use the next 10 minutes to think about it in your scenarios. Think about it, from a systems, institutional perspective. What is your organization doing to hold itself accountable to its DEI statement? And if it doesn't have one, maybe think about encouraging to make one. But what these two were just talking about is so big, it's so massive, and the only way that we can talk about changing systems is by accountability. So in this next 10 minutes, as you're working through the scenario questions, just keep that in the back of your brain of how you can take these answers, these solutions back into your organizations for accountability. One of the things that we talked about that just really struck a chord with me is how many people, during the pandemic, how many people noticed that Band-Aid, the Band-Aid company, came out with multiple Band-Aids of color, like various shades of brown and beige and white and black. Didn't that feel like that was huge, right? And that was a success for many people who are experiencing colorism in our country and the impacts and effects and trauma of colorism, of never seeing yourself in a successful role, never seeing someone who looks like you with the same skin tone as you in positions of power. And then suddenly we have Band-Aids that match everybody. Same thing with Crayola and all of the skin tones. Those are successes. And that leads us to our next round of questions. What are some examples of successful implementation of trauma-informed services or anything else that helps reduce the effects and impacts of these systemic barriers?
I can start maybe from some things that we've been seeing, right, around some of the credit bureaus taking away medical debt, right, as, one of the, right, a success in itself, and who was impacted in that. But I will say that is not, that's just not enough, right? That's just not enough. I think the way in which, there are organizations and programs that are coming out, fintech companies that are really shifting the landscape for a lot of financial institutions around how to be inclusive, how to break down barriers to access to credit, affordable credit. So you'll see things, I know for us as a credit union, we've invested in something called Zest AI, which is an underwriting tool to really look at different ways in which home buyers or folks applying for credit or whatever it may be, the way their credit profiles looked at, because that in itself, right, the way the credit system is, it's ladled with racism and oppression, and so it impacts folks differently. But I think those are some examples, and you start to see that in different spaces. You start to see different service providers coming together, right? But it's, there's a lot of work to be done, right? The system wasn't just built overnight. This is 300 plus years of the system existing. And so not to be a downer in that, there just has to be a level of commitment across. It's gonna take all of us to truly create change within the world, within the nation, yeah.
And for me, I'm not in banking, so what I would say as a positive is the fact that we're having this conversation about trauma-informed services, and we're looking at the whole big picture. Yeah. We're looking at it from a macro level lens, meso, community, micro, the individual. We're seeing how it's not you, the individual, it's what happened to you, the individual, and the systems that have been put in place that may impact you for whatever reason. But I guess the big thing is really just having the conversation, setting up EAP services, ensuring that there's maybe another set of services or funds to ensure that your colleagues, your peers are able to receive the mental health services that they need. Those are some of the things that I'm seeing within my line of work.
Yeah. Awesome, thank you. I think something else that y'all just make my brain sparkle with ideas. Something else that I've seen that is like a recent change in behavior over the past 3 to 5 years is people changing the way that they move into careers. And the fact that right now we're seeing an increase in the number of people who are going into trades or skipping college entirely because of college debt, student loan debt. And so they've seen the weight that their parents had or that their older siblings had, and so they're making the choice to not go to college or to only go to a community college or a trade school, or save up the money, work with a financial coach or a financial advisor to save up the money so that they come out without any debt. So it's interesting how trauma is affecting our behaviors even right now, today. So I think that was the last of our questions for the panelists for now. See, we kept it short. So we're gonna give you all a few more minutes to go to questions 3 in your scenario. For those of you that are in the Justice Involved group and the Immigrant and Refugee group, apologies, the way that the printout came out. Your question 3 is at the top of the page. So thank you for, again, giving us a little bit of grace with those technology issues we had this morning. So we wanted to give you all a little bit of time to share out if you would like. So if you would like to share out some of the ideas, the thoughts, the solutions that you came up with, or opportunities to improve the scenario that your imaginary client was going through, please raise your hand. And we have Mr. Irwin over here who's gonna run around. So raise your hand if you would like to share out. Oh, and we also have a gentleman over here. Okay. And when you share out, can you give a brief summary of your scenario? That way people have some context, and then the highlights of your conversation.
I was volunteered. So our scenario, we're the Justice Involved Action Squad. So our scenario was someone being newly released from prison, having to figure out making money, doesn't have a bank account, doesn't know what they need to get one, owes the IRS but doesn't know how to file their taxes, needs to buy a car but has bad credit, things like that. So we had an idea we wanted to share about how to get justice-involved people the support that they need. We talked about maybe having case managers, someone that works with them on the inside, and then as they come out, it helps them transition into society and navigating resources that are available and helping them just figure everything out. And we talked about having a credit union that's specifically for incarcerated people, that knows the struggles that they're facing, that can offer them specific services that will help them. We did identify that if you have a credit union that's just for incarcerated people, then you use that in the world, people might also look at you and be like, oh, you were an incarcerated person, and create some bias. So we didn't completely solve everything, but we had a great conversation, and yeah.
No, I love that idea. So the Navy has a credit union, so why can't people that were formerly incarcerated? Yeah. Love that idea. Any credit unions want to do that, like jump on board? And if you take that idea, make sure you're crediting this table. Anyways. Anyone else want to share out what their group talked about? Oh, I know that hand. That's Heather. Goodwill. Also, if you have questions, you're welcome to raise your hand and ask questions of Ziquora or Ashley.
Calling out my whole table here. They're all geniuses behind me. So we had immigrants and refugees, and we have Zara, who is, let's see, she is Swahili speaking. She's a caregiver. She is a battered woman. She is leaving the father of her children and getting a restraining order, and that time in the court has caused her to work less and fall behind on her bills, and now she's getting those calls from those creditors saying that, threatening her, and we're going to call ICE. And so in our first discussion, lots of really good discussion, but her underlying factor is just fear across the board. It's just fear. And during this discussion, again, a really, really good conversation, but I think where we landed on, and my team can yell at me if I'm forgetting anything, but I think where we landed was just meeting people where they're at. We say it so much that it's become something that we just say. And doing it, that's what takes, real commitment, real hard work, and that really makes that difference. And so, really, like, bankers, credit unions can help this gal out a lot. And them coming into, we talked about them coming into a church. Somebody had said that earlier, and that was brought up. Coming to, into community, but really like meeting them where they're at. Not just bringing your bank into the community, because that is definitely needed, but sending out representatives to speak to people and to take some of that fear away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. I know we didn't necessarily explicitly say it, but meeting people where they're at literally and metaphorically is so important, and moving beyond just like exactly what you said, moving beyond it just being words. Like what I do, we use the term the work. We're doing the work a lot. We're doing so much of the work. We don't even know what the work means anymore because we say it so often. So yeah, just sitting in a moment and rethinking the phrases that we use and how they become placeholders for something that we don't understand anymore. Yeah. And you two are more than welcome to interject too, by the way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's part of it too. I'll also add the investment with that, not only just building the relationships, but the investment with the community partners that may not always get access to the funding, right? To really be intentional with the way in which we are truly partnering in community, not just from a transactional level, right? What does that look like? And then to your point around defining what that is, there has to be a common language within the organization and understanding around what does it look like for us to show up authentically. So more internal work.
Awesome. Anyone else want to share out, or anybody have questions? I mean, I can keep talking, but y'all don't want me to. So we have about 8 minutes left, I think, at this point. Ziquora, Ashley, are there any final words that you would like to share? Any thoughts that you weren't able to express because I rushed through?
Oh, there's a hand.
Oh, we got a hand. Okay,
Saved
good.
by the hand.
What I was going to say is golden, so I don't want to give it away, but I was going to ask you a question.
Okay,
Yep.
ask a question. There's a mic
You got a
right
microphone
behind
right
you.
behind you.
Yeah, my name's Beth. I realize this question is unfair because you could have a lot to say about it, but when creating educational spaces for adult learners, in person or virtual, live virtual, what are some of the top things you would encourage me and others who do that kind of work to take into consideration, to plan for, to try and make space for in terms of trauma-informed approaches and thinking? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I would encourage the trainers or the person who's creating those spaces to do their own work first. Come in grounded and centered, have some sort of practice. So me, I pray before I go in. I'll listen to some gospel music. Sometimes I'll go outside and I will ground myself on the soil as indigenous people did, going back to some of those traditions that aren't talked about but still heal us in certain ways. Tapping. But you know you and you know your own body, and maybe you don't know what it is that you need to do, so you may need to reach out to an expert who can teach you some things like tapping. I do a lot of public speaking, so you'll see me hiding my hands under here and I'm tapping it out. And if you're not familiar with tapping, basically it's acupuncture for the brain. And Harvard did a study and they looked at people who were experiencing anxiety and they scanned their brains. And then they looked at people who did traditional talk therapy, which is what I do, did actual acupuncture and then did tapping, and they saw that the brain scans of those who did tapping were most improved, and also they self-reported that they had the least amount of anxiety and depression when doing tapping. But I feel like we create these spaces and we haven't done our own work and we're not prepared for the responses, and sometimes, a lot of the time they're uncomfortable, but we have to get uncomfortable in order to fully be comfortable, because when we think about who's been comfortable lately, it ain't been black and brown folks. Definitely ain't been me. So, we need to shake up the space a little bit, and we talk about making safe spaces, and we walk on these eggshells because we want to continue to make sure that these spaces are safe for the dominant society, and who are we leaving out? And it's tough, and it's difficult, and just prepare yourself for that mentally, and have a tribe. Who else is doing these workshops? Get together with them, have conversations, see some of the techniques. But again, start with self and just have your own inner practice, meditation, music, whatever your body tells you that you need. I said prayer, gospel music, grounding, but that might not work for you. So you have to find out what works for you and your body.
Yeah. If I could just add to, I would also say a lot of what is being said is really operationalizing that, right, for both self and even from an organizational level, but even to the point of like having something like a community agreement for when you're entering into the space, and a set of co-creation of the rules together and how you're going to engage with one another is definitely a part of that. But I couldn't amplify your message more around you have to start with self. You absolutely do. And starting with self too, to be sustainable in this journey, because it's not something that ends, it's, you know, continuous. And so what are the practices that you're doing to really support yourself in that as well?
Can I add something too, as a person who does trainings but hates the term training? When you're doing your self-work, also look at the power you have in that space. So what is your identity? Are you a cisgender, heterosexual white man in his mid-30s with a high-paying job? How you show up in that training is going to impact and affect the people that you're talking to and how they digest and even perceive you. So think about your identity and how it shows up and how that might be intentionally or not exuding power over the people that you're talking with instead of building power with the people you're working with. And then the other thing that I would recommend is don't make assumptions about what the people know. Because chances are there is somebody in the room that is way smarter, way more experienced, and way more knowledgeable than you. So don't make assumptions that you're the expert, especially if you're talking to people that you are not familiar with. You're not familiar with their community or their background or anything like that. So I just got the 1 minute warning, like 15 seconds ago. So now we're down to 30 seconds. I want to thank Ziquora and Ashley for being here today, for having this conversation with us. I hope that you all had the chance to delve a little bit deeper into these action groups, maybe made some connections that you didn't have before, and learned something that you can take with you and implement or think about and come together in your organization to implement at a later date. Thank you all again. And now we're into a 15-minute break. Is that right?